I already presented this, the basic idea, but today we will do something slightly different. The basic idea that I want to start from is why it is so important to understand what is consciousness. So in a way, it is a follow-up of the conversation that we had a couple of days ago. And to understand why it is so important to have a good notion of what is consciousness, is that if we don't have a good understanding of what is consciousness, we are going to live in a lie. And a famous example of this situation, existential situation, is Madame Bovary. Madame Bovary had a wrong notion of her own life, had a wrong notion of what she would like to be, and therefore the direction that her life took was different from the direction that she would have liked her life to be. And the difference between these two directions has been called by Aldous Huxley in The Doors of Perception, a book that many of you probably know, the Bovary's angle, which is the difference between the life that we have and the life that we would like to have. And this difference sometimes is the outcome of our life circumstances, but sometimes it is the effect of a wrong notion of what we are. And who tells us that we have a wrong notion? Well, in many ways, the authority. And the authority in this century is science. So I'm a scientist. I'm a hardcore scientist. I'm a physicalist. So I don't talk against science. But science has presented us with a view of the world which is like Groucho Marx club. We don't have any place in nature as it is described by physics today. If you look inside a physics book, we're not going to find anything like us. If you look inside the equations of physics, we're not going to find anything like ourselves. Anything like, and this is the problem I'm dealing with, consciousness. That's why consciousness is called a hard problem, because in physics there isn't anything like consciousness. So, physics, in order to find ourselves, has been looking inside our body, has been looking inside the mechanism of the body. Neurons, liver, muscles, lungs, blood, metabolism. But so far, we have not found anything like us inside the scientific picture of the body. There are many theories, but so far there are no scientific theory about how to transmogrify neural activity into our familiar experience. And we trust science, because science is the authority that tells us what is real and what is not. And this authority has a long tradition. It started with Plato. Plato was the first to tell everyone that we have to believe to a different reality than the one that we see, than the one in which we live. Only who has get rid of eyes and ears and of the whole body is likely to attain true knowledge. But is that true? The same thing has been told to us by the founder of science, Galileo. I cannot find any bounds for my admiration how that reason was able to commit such a rape on the senses. Now here the senses are Madame Bovary, the woman I started from, the woman that struggled to match her own life with the expectation that society and authority asked to her. Now I'm a philosopher, so I take everything from a very broad perspective. But the problem of Madame Bovary, in a way, started with this mismatch between the truth that science and authority asked us to believe about the structure of the world and our everyday experience, our everyday senses. So systematically, science and philosophy and the authority in general asked us not to believe in what in ourselves, basically, not to believe in our own experience. And the name for our own individual experience in science is consciousness. So this keeps happening today. If we read scientific journals, we find the same notion. We have to believe in something which is not what we see. The reality we see is not the reality that exists. This is to say, the reality of Madame Bovary is not the reality of science. And the reality of science is, of course, more important. So basically, science is telling us we see the world in many different ways, but there's only one correct way to see the world. And this way is the one that science suggests us. Is the one that science tells. There's only one apple. And now we start to see why I brought with me an apple, and I asked you to have one apple. But in fact, we may be colorblind. We may be blind. We may have a different way to see apples. So, in reality, there might be, for us, at least there are, many different apples. And I am sure that if I could see the experiences, if I could see the apples that each of you are holding in their hands right now, you're going to have a different experience of apple. So right now, although this apple seems to be all more or less the same, I'm sure that when you grab them in your hand, they are different because they have a unique relation with yourself. If I had time, I would have liked to write your names on each apple, just to give you an idea that in the moment in which you grab an apple is no longer an objective scientific apple, but it becomes your own apple, without being, and that's important, a subjective apple. And keep in mind that subjective is a derogatory term in science. So it has been one way for science to throw away our own experience in the name of something that was allegedly better. So I am proposing you to take into consideration a completely different picture, not of your own experience, and that's the key proposal, but of nature. I'm asking you to consider a different understanding of the apple that you're grabbing, that you're holding in your hands. And the reason why I brought with me an apple, and now I ask you to hold this apple in front of you and to stare at the apple, is to ask yourself, at this very moment, when I'm looking at the apple, at this apple that my hand is holding, what do I find in my experience? What is my consciousness made of at this very moment? Is it made of abstract patterns? It is made of neural activity? Or it is made by this very object that I hold in my hand? Think about your experience, not think about what people told you about your experience. Isn't there in your experience something which is red, round, shiny, and applish? Isn't there something in your experience which is physically just like your apple? And my point is that right now your experience, if you're staring at the apple, is made by the apple itself. So my suggestion is that we are not confined inside the body, prisoner of the Platonic cage. We are not inside the body. We are not the construction of the brain. But we are made by the very object, which in this case is the apple, which is in front of our body. Not in front of us, which is in front of our body. We will say more about that. But the point is that this object is not as simple as it seems. Actually, this object has many more properties that science told, or at least that a naive interpretation of science told us it has. What are these properties? Well, let me start with a very simple property. This is an example that I've already made in this very room. Is this apple still or moving? All of you know that this object is both moving and still, because velocity is relative. So this object has umpteen velocities. It is actually moving in all possible directions. Why don't we see all this movement? If this object is just right now moving everywhere, in all possible directions, why don't we see this movement? Because, for us, this object has only one velocity. Which one? The one relative to our body. But that doesn't mean that it has only that velocity. It only means that this object has, that the property that are one with our own experience are only those properties that take place because relative to our body. This is velocity. Is it true for all other properties of the apple? Some of you, I see, have already eaten the apple. I'm happy that you've done so. And, of course, if you eat the apple is private, because once you've eaten the apple, you cannot share the apple any longer. You can just share another piece of the apple, but the piece that you've just eaten cannot be shared. And I will show you that that's true for all other properties of the apple. But let me go to another property of the apple, color. Now, look at that patch. That's the patch on a computer screen, which is more or less white. Is it really white? Well, all of you know that if you get closer to that patch, you would see the little lights, the photodiodes, the red, green, blue grid a computer screen is made of. So actually, if you got very close to the screen, you would have seen the red, green, blue pattern. So the question is that pattern white or is it red, green, and blue? And the answer is both. Is white relative to a human body at more than 1 meter of distance, and it is red, green, and blue relative to another body, relative to a fly, relative to someone very close, relative to an eagle that has a much higher, a much better sight than we have. And that shows that colors, and we will get to the rainbow soon, are not unique. They're not there. Every object may have more than one color. But the same holds true for more complex objects, like a sunset. This is where I come from, Lavagna. Every day we have the sunset, and we may believe that the line of the sun takes place only in one place. But that's not true, because if we move, the line of the sun would move together with us. Actually, all of the sea surface is shining. Like in the point where we see the line of the sun. All of the sea is shining at sunset. Why do we see only one line? Because that line exists physically relative to our own body. It is just like the only velocity we experience. But that's not what it takes place there. Like there are multiple colors, like there are multiple velocities, so there are multiple sunsets. Likewise, it is possible to show that every property that we think to be in the world exists in multiple versions. The rainbow is a wonderful example. When we look at the rainbow, we believe to see the same rainbow that everyone sees. But the fact is that every body, in the sense of every space body, sees a different rainbow. Which one? The one relative to that particular body. So, we believe object to be either white or yellow or green, but the fact is that every object has multiple colors. And this allows us to have a completely different view of the apple. The apple is no longer a humble object with a simple property, but the apple is an object with multiple properties, different for each of our own body. So each different body, colorblind, someone with normal eyesight, a tetrachromat, for example, you know that 4% of women have an additional photoreceptor. So women are likely to see more colors, or at least a subset of women, than men. And probably they see a different apple, because their body is different. And so there's a different apple for every different human body. Actually, there's a different apple for every different object. And what about colors? Once again, we have the conflict between our own experience, in which we believe the world of being colored, and the scientific view, which surprisingly tells us that colors don't exist. If you take every article in Neuroscience about color perception, they start by saying, colors don't exist. The world is colorless. Colors are created in the brain. So you see that right now the world is colorless. This is the official position of science. Because they were not able to locate colors in the world, they decided the color should not exist. That was an interesting solution. But this is the official position of science. So which of the two views is the correct one? Are colors in the external world, or are colors created in the brain? On one side we have Madame Bovary. On the other side we have the official position of science, here represented by Plato, rather than by a modern neuroscientist. And let's make a very quick experiment to see who is right. Stare at the cross. I've done this already, but let's do it again in this situation, because that's very important. Stare at the cross for 15 seconds. From this side, it will be slightly more difficult, but let's try to do it again. So keep staring at the cross and letting 15 seconds to go by. And then for a moment, you see a new square. So I went back. So you saw a new square for just a few seconds. Was it colored or was it gray? Colored. Okay, now look at the square with ease, and you see that it was gray. Now let me ask you, which color was closer to your own experience? Good. You may be surprised that science today, in all textbook on physics, tells us that we should have seen B, while you saw A. So once again, we have a conflict between our own experience and science. And the point is that science believes in a model of colors where colors live in an abstract geometrical space. So when we don't see red, we have to see green, because that's a prediction of science. But in reality, there's a much simpler explanation, that because you've been staring at the red cross, you became unable to pick up the red component of the external world. So you saw another apple. You changed your body. It is as though you changed your movement and you were able to see another color. So you see the leftover of the existing color in the external world. You saw cyan. So we have a conflict here. On one side, we have the naive notion that the world is colored. But this notion has some problems. Because, for example, you saw a cyan square, while the square was gray. So science suggested us that the world is colorless, and colors are just an illusion. But it is possible to take into consideration a completely different picture. Namely, the idea that the world is much richer than it seems, that the world is a rainbow world, where everything has all possible colors. Only we can't experience only a few of them. And that would provide also an interesting explanation of certain experiences we have when we take psychoactive drugs. Because all of a sudden we may see reality as it is, as a rainbow rather than as a naive physical world. So, in order to get a grasp of this rainbow world, first of all, we have to get rid of the myth of the brain in a vat. The idea that the world that we see is created by a brain. Why people claim that? Because people had a naive notion of the external world. If I say the external world has only one color, then I have to explain the difference in everyone's experience by suggesting that colors are created inside the brain. But if all these colors are there, are outside my body, just waiting to be seen, I don't need to put the burden on the brain, because they're already outside. And what about hallucination? Well, to see hallucination, we will get back to our apple, And we will see that our apple is much, much more interesting than it seems. Because our apple is not only a travel in a relative world, physical world, but it is also, in a way, a time machine. So imagine that this apple gets bigger and bigger, and brighter, but also farther and farther away from us. This apple becomes the moon, which is basically another apple, much bigger and floating in the sky. Would that be any different? Of course, it would no longer be an apple, it would be a big planet, a big satellite. But would anything be, in a strong sense, different? No, it would be just a round-shaped object at a slightly greater distance. And what if this apple were even farther and farther away, like the sun? It would be the same. In these three situations, though, because of the larger distance, the apple, moon, and sun becomes not only farther in space, but also farther in time. So, the point is that we may have a completely different notion of space-time. Once again, we have to step outside of the comfort zone of the naive notion, of the naive physical view of reality. We must see reality not as something where everything has just one property and where everything takes place in an instantaneous present. But we must see reality as something unfolding, both in space and time, and where everything has multiple properties. So, to get back to the, that's me. So, we usually take that the present has to be in that point where our body is, like the arms of a clock. So, we assume that everything we perceive has to take place there. But this has been rejected by science, by Einstein, because we know that everything takes place in time. So the fact is that this is not a good picture of the physical world. This is a good picture of the physical world, where everything takes place in a different space-time position. Once we accept that position, we need no longer to have a mental reproduction of the external world. We need no longer to have things inside our mind, inside not only in terms of inside our, the place where our brain is, but also inside the time in which our brain does what it does. But we might reconsider the notion of the present as something which is spread in space and crucially in time. And if we do that, we can reconsider all mental experiences in terms of actual external world. So all our moments are still constitutive with what we are. We are still made of everything we've been interacting with. And the suggestion is that the present is not a point, but is extended. And is extended why? Because it is relative to our body. So at any time, we bring into existence a world. And this is not me, but it is Einstein who suggested a view like that. Only that nobody took seriously his analysis of simultaneity. He said simultaneity is not taking place at the same time. That's a naive notion. Simultaneity, being in the present, means to interact with the body, he called that a reference frame, at this very same moment. And this allows us to see our experience as a way to recombine the world. This artist, Bernard Prass, shows us how it is possible to put together familiar objects to produce new objects. And that may be an explanation of our dreams and hallucinations as a way in which the world takes place in a novel way relative to our body. So you can see that familiar objects, chairs, tables, a shark, a clock, can be recombined in whatever we want to do, without having to create anything. Here, there's no mental representation. It is just a way to recombine familiar objects. So, let's put it all together. This view suggests to see reality from the point of view of a relative world. And it suggests to see us as something which is one and the same with the world. And this is a blow to our narcissism, because we like to think that we are special. But it might be that after all, what it is special is the world, which is much richer than we expected it to be. So we have to give up the anthropocentric view of reality. We have to give up the idea that the Earth is at the center of the universe and that we as human beings are somehow at the center of reality. It was a good idea. In Renaissance, people were very fond of that idea. But after all, the Earth is not in a special place in the universe. Human beings are not a special animal among the other animals. And it might be that our mind is not special in any way. So rather than putting the mind at the center of the world, I suggest you to put the world itself. And our body becomes the arm, the proxies of worlds, real physical world that acts through our bodies. And when I saw, so the suggestion is that we are one and the same with the world we have an experience of. But for a moment, look at the last, the idea that we are all circling around an object. Now, that reminded me of the circle that we do here at the end, when we all hold hands. And when we do that, metaphorically speaking, we bring together worlds. We are not that's not just a meeting of bodies. That's not just a meeting of physiological bodies. That's not just a meeting of cells. That's a meeting of world. Each of us is carrying with itself a world, a whole world. And when we put together in that circle, we bring into existence a new world in which everyone is giving a possibility to a relative world to take place in a new way. So my suggestion is to see our bodies not as one and the same with us, but to consider a new possibility, that our body is just the condition for the existence of a relative world. And when we meet, we bring into existence a completely new world, a rainbow world. Thank you.